Greetings, Stanford. My name is David Ilmar Leppasaar Beecher, and I am Tartu University's first visiting professor of the Estonian diaspora, or first expatriate visiting professor. And it's my pleasure to talk to you today about to introduce you to some aspects of the history of Estonia that you might not know very much about, and to help you see Estonia in a larger global context as a place that you might be interested in for pursuing your own interests and topics in areas ranging from cultural studies to cybersecurity to all forms of political science and history as well. I'm myself a historian. I did my PhD at UC Berkeley with the historian Yuri Snyozkin, and I spent several years teaching at Berkeley before coming here to Tartu, so I'm very familiar with your neck of the woods. I spent quite a bit of time in Stanford as well. But I want to begin my presentation to you today in search of a usable past, memory and forgetting in post-Soviet Estonia, by paraphrasing an interesting comment made by the British essayist and historian Timothy Garton Ash, claimed at one point that when America, or when Americans call something history, they want to throw it away. They want to consign it to an ash can, to a trash can. But when Europeans call something history, brace yourself for a long talk and perhaps a long conflict. To say something is history is to say it's important in Europe. To say something is history in America is often to say it's unimportant, at least in our popular everyday discourse. And my presentation to you today is really about the weight of the past and the importance of history to Estonia, to Europe more broadly, and perhaps for why we should notice and pay attention to it in order to make sense of our place in the world and how Estonia relates to the larger questions of the world you might be interested in. My presentation to you today is divided into 4 parts. It really begins small and gets large. I want to begin with some particular, unpacking one incident that happened in 2007, and then move to reflect on the larger implications and historical importance of that one event. This is the case of the Bronze Soldier. And the riots that erupted around the Bronze Soldier, pictured here on this first slide, in 2007. But without further ado, here is a short clip, a film clip, or rather a clip from Estonian television that I managed to capture back in 2011 when the parliamentary debates were going on in Estonia. It's only about 30 seconds. It's only in Estonian, but I've translated the important text here into English. So I invite you to listen and reflect.
Lenski, ma palun 8 inimest ootab teie järgi, siin on... Mina olen üksi, ma istutan üksi Vene kogukonda. Aleksei Lotman, palun. Ma tahtsingi õiendada ühe väga väikese asja. Lisaks härra Klenskile olen ka mina siin nii-öelda mitte Eesti päritolu ja ma kategooriliselt protesteerin, ei ole Eestis mingisugust rahvuslikku diskrimineerimist. Ei ole Eestis olemas rahvuslikku.
So this very brief clip is in order to get us into the theme of today's talk as quickly as possible. This is a confrontation during the Estonian parliamentary debates of 2011 between Dmitry Klensky, representing the Russian Party, and Alexei Lotman, representing the Green Party. We see them making very different claims about the status of minorities, and especially Russian-speaking minorities, in Estonia today. Klensky claims that the Russian community is being oppressed, that it has not been granted its rights, that it has been forgotten by the Estonian national community. Alexei Lotman says, I too am not of ethnic Estonian origin, and I categorically protest against the notion that there's any ethnic discrimination in Estonia. So what is going on here? These Estonian parliamentary debates back in 2011 were a useful and perhaps a helpful place to begin reflecting on the position of Estonia in Europe, Estonia and in the world, and the position of national minorities in Estonia. Because this is one of the two great themes that is most often noticed in the Western press. And to begin properly with the first section of this lecture, or presentation, post-Soviet Estonia, open or closed, I would argue to you that in the Western media, the representation of Estonia, and particularly in the New York Times, and I examined pretty much all the articles published in the New York Times over the course of the 1990s, there are really two ways in which Estonia figures. One as opened and the other as closed. Or another way to put it, Estonia is sometimes represented as a neoliberal paradise, and at other times it's represented as a mono-ethnic purgatory. What I mean by that is that it's represented as a place, as a neoliberal paradise. Estonia is the place where it's praised for its market reforms, for deregulation, for privatization of services industry, for services and industry, for its high-tech sector, for the invention of Skype. All of these things are seen as exemplary examples of the way in which Estonia is participating in a global economy, doing capitalism well, beating the Americans to some extent, even at their own game. Significant that the Estonian Prime Minister, actually two of the Estonian Prime Ministers, Mart Laar and Andrus Ansip, both adopted Milton Friedman as a kind of guru. And Mart Laar even won the Friedman Prize for Liberty from the Cato Institute in 2006. In an article from the Times, December 21st, 2005, Mark Landler writes, under the title, "A Land of Northern Lights, Cyber Cafes and the Flat Tax," that the first tip-off to Estonia's high-tech economy and market fundamentalism is the government's cabinet room, outfitted less like a ceremonial chamber than a control center. Each minister has a flat-screen computer to transmit votes during debates. Then there's Estonia's idea of an intellectual hero, Steve Forbes, the American publishing scion, two-time candidate for the Republican presidential nomination and tireless evangelist for the flat tax. Fired with a free market fervor and hurtling into the high-tech future, Estonia feels more like a Baltic outpost of Silicon Valley than Europe. 19 months after it achieved its cherished goal of joining the European Union, one might even characterize Estonia as the un-Europe. So this is an extreme, but typical also, characterization of Estonia from the 1990s. That is, Estonia as the frontrunner for bringing technological progress, bringing capitalism, bringing a free market to Europe at large, a country from which a lot of other countries could learn an awful lot. And this is why I describe this image of Estonia as open and also as a neoliberal paradise, a place that implemented the flat tax long before any other, well, I think most other parts of the world. In the early 1990s already, it was a place where a lot of Republican and neoconservative ideologues thought that politics was being done in the right way. But this is only one of the two images of post-Soviet Estonia. The other image is the one that is comparatively closed, and which I characterize here on this first slide as a monoethnic purgatory. Estonia is condemned as a monoethnic purgatory for its treatment of Estonia's non-ethnic Estonians. It's condemned for its ethnic citizenship law, which left more than 100,000 Russian immigrants from the Soviet period stateless after independence, supplying them instead with gray passports that did not make them citizens of any existing state. In some sense, it consigned a large portion of its population, according to this view, to a kind of purgatory. People who are not proper inhabitants or citizens of any given place. This appears in articles like one by Clifford J. Levy on June 7, 2010, when he writes about language inspection coming to Estonia. The title of the article is Estonia raises its pencils to erase Russian. And observes that following a decision to force all schools in the state to teach 60% of their subjects in the state language, this has left 40% in the domain of the ethnic Russian-speaking minority. In another article on the fate of Estonia's Russian population from August 15, 2012, again, Clifford Levy writes in the New York Times about how the Soviet legacy lingers as Estonia defines its people. So my provocation, or the provocation with which I want to begin this lecture, is really which of these images of Estonia, post-Soviet Estonia, is the most accurate? Or what can we learn from the fact that the New York Times and the Western media more broadly is particularly interested in these two questions? The question of an open market on the one hand, and the question of a closed citizenry on the other. How Estonia has opened itself up to capitalism while failing, in some sense, to open itself up to political liberalism in the widest possible sense. Now, the very fact that these things go together, and for a long time in America, I think we assumed that that one needed to have both an open citizenry and an open economy, is instructive, I think, in more ways than one. And it can help, and I think I would argue that the weight of historical memory in Estonia over the course of the last century, this history that Americans tend to consign to the ash can, but which Europeans see as a place to begin an open debate, is partly what explains the coexistence of two things that for a long time, perhaps not so much in the post-Trump era, but for a long time in America, were thought of as unthinkable, or at least not belonging together. Estonia, like all countries, and perhaps especially European countries, and even more especially Eastern European countries, is in pursuit and in need of a usable past. That is to say, some way of thinking about its history that can make it an effective participant in a larger global and world economy and a community, and also a way to make it participate in, and more specifically, within a European context. But it's precisely the difficulties of finding or achieving a usable past, which I would claim lay at the root of so many of Estonia's problems today. I would add to this, though, that it's not only the question of the international community, whether defined globally or defined in European terms, but it's also the question of Estonia's relationship to its own citizens, which the problematic aspect of which we saw raised already in that opening video. The question of how to incorporate its minority populations, how to reconcile ideological differences or differences in point of view. Ultimately, should we agree more with Alexei Lotman, who says that Estonia has done very well by its minorities, or with Dmitry Klensky, the head of the Russian party for a long time, who claimed that Estonia had forgotten or had isolated or condemned its minorities to a kind of position of marginality. Before moving on to the core of today's lecture, which is really the Bronze Soldier and the Bronze Soldier riots that erupted in 2007, I want to just say a few words about Klensky and Lotman as interesting and important participants in a larger debate about Estonian identity and as important representatives of the minority population. Alexei Lotman is the son of Yuri Lotman, perhaps the most famous immigrant to Estonia in the 20th century, a refugee from the Soviet Union's anti-cosmopolitan campaign under Stalin in the 1950s or late 40s and early 50s. Yuri Lotman came to Estonia, to Soviet Estonia, looking for work at a time when he couldn't find employment in any other part of the Soviet Union. The explicitly anti-Semitic policies of the Soviet Union in that year made it impossible for him to find not only work in Leningrad or Moscow, but actually he tried in other national republics of the Soviet Union as well. And it was almost by chance that he ended up getting a job at the Pedagogical Institute of Tartu, the city where I am right now, and eventually at Tartu University, and became, over the course of the next decades, one of the 2 or 3 most important public intellectuals in all of the Soviet Union, and one of the prominent public intellectuals in all of Europe. His theories of semiotics, of how signs and symbols work, of how, and above all, of how signs and symbols work, was what made him sort of attractive and interesting to commentators in the West, like Julia Kristeva in France. And it also gave him an important role in all kinds of post-colonial and post-Soviet debates in interpreting the relationships between selves and others, and the way we construct a relationship to other people who are similar to or different from us. He was the central figure, or the hero, you might even say, of my dissertation on Tartu University, which I defended in Berkeley back in 2014. Dmitry Klensky, for his part, was also a child of immigrants to Estonia in the Soviet period. Born in 1945 in Tallinn. He was a journalist and editor for many Soviet-era newspapers. Both of them, one might add, speak perfect or unaccented Estonian, but they conceive of their position and their place as ethnic minorities very differently. It's interesting that Alexei Lotman, the son of Yuri Lotman, born in 1960, became, in the course of the 2011 parliamentary debates, a staunch defender or supporter of a kind of inclusive vision of the Estonian nation, and defending it against the accusation that it was not in fact so inclusive as was argued by Klensky at the same time. What I want to do with all of this for you right now is evoke the tensions, the conflicts in post-Soviet Estonia, both as they have been represented in the Western media, and especially in the New York Times, and as they have emerged locally in Estonia, in the words of commentators like Lotman and Klensky, to give us a sense of the problems and the questions concerning post-Soviet Estonian identity today. What is it? Now, and having already unpacked for you somewhat the neoliberal paradise and the monoethnic purgatory, I want to turn to a single monument and a single incident through which I think we can make a better sense of Estonia's place in the world today and its interest to us in the world at large. The Bronze Soldier was a monument constructed in Tallinn at the end of the Second World War, or after the end of the Second World War, to commemorate the so-called liberation of Estonia from the Nazis by the Soviet. The symbol and the monument itself stood relatively uncommented, unremarked throughout the 1990s. But in the early 2000s, it became an object of intense scrutiny, also of popular expressions, both of displeasure and of piety. Russians brought flowers to the monument, as pictured here. Estonians plied it with graffiti. And a larger question erupted in the Estonian public sphere, you could say, about what the Bronze Soldier symbolized and what it represented, what role it played in a larger politics of post-Soviet Estonian memory. Now, the problem, or the question, that galvanized the conversation about the bronze soldier really had to do with the nature of the Soviet presence in Estonia from 1950 to 1990. Presence that is usually described as an occupation. An occupation during which 300,000 Soviet immigrants, more than 300,000 Soviet immigrants, came to Estonia, taking up jobs. They came as military personnel, but also as laborers. And their arrival after what was seen as an illegitimate occupation in the Second World War was really what was at stake now in this post-Soviet period. As I pointed out, many Russians who came in this period were given gray passports. The citizenship law was made such that that they had to pass a test that would of language in order to gain citizenship, and many chose not to take the test or failed the test, did not. And the question of what this Russian minority means, represents to post-Soviet Estonia became a really volatile question. It's worth bearing in mind that this was not really so much a volatile question in the 1990s, but it really became a volatile question after 2003 or 2004, after Estonia joined NATO and Estonia joined the EU. And that's worth bearing in mind or thinking about when we talk about post-Soviet Estonian identity in a larger European and global context. A key date in this whole process was May 9th, 2005, Soviet Victory Day, when these outpourings of love and respect for the bronze soldier in a central square in Tallinn became the most prominent and most dramatic. This year and then the following year it grew even more. More flowers were brought to the feet of the bronze soldier, which sparked kind of angry responses from the Estonian population that, no, this bronze soldier actually symbolizes our occupation. It symbolizes a Soviet Union that was an occupier and that was an oppressor, not a liberator. But that's really perhaps the right way to see what's at stake in whether you bring graffiti or whether you bring flowers to the monument. Was the Soviet Union an occupier that oppressed for 50 years, or nearly 50 or 40 years, a sovereign independent peoples, deporting them to labor camps in the Soviet Union? Or was it a liberator from Nazism? And did it play an important role in ending the hegemony of Hitler's Germany in Europe? Of course, the answer is somewhat both. But these are memories that are very painful to both sides in their own ways. And we can see why the tenacity of the past, why the past continues to matter, why it can and how it can erupt unexpectedly sometimes into the present, is perhaps nowhere better brought out, in the case of Estonia at least, than in the example of the bronze soldier monument and the politics of memory that grew up around it. Now, the riots themselves really all unfolded over the course of really one night in April of 2007. Here are some images that I'm providing you with. April 26, 2007, the Bronze Night. Images from the night itself. We see the police in riot gear sort of trying to prevent demonstrators who are marching through the streets of Tallinn. And we see images below of the monument as I often encountered it actually when I came to Tallinn to do my research in 2005 and 6. Perhaps really kind of an unremarkable and or rather an unnoticed monument as standing kind of neglected here in the middle of a square. Now, the riots were provoked by the decision of the Prime Minister, Andrus Ansip, already cited before in this lecture, to remove the monument to a local cemetery. a cemetery for other sort of defunct and monuments from the Soviet era, and for the fallen of that era as well. And we see on the right here an image of the monument replaced or displaced from its central place in Tallinn to a place in the cemetery. And the middle picture there below is of what has become of that central place, now without the monument, where flowers are planted and where the image of, or rather the monument itself, has been erased. Now, but for many Russians who had been sort of commemorating the monument in 2005 and 2006, this was some kind of sacrilege. It was diminishing or questioning the value of the contribution of the Red Army to the liberation of Estonia, to the liberation of Europe. Many appeared at these events with the older members of the Russian community with their medals pinned to their breast. And at the same time, they were reminded by the Estonian demonstrators at the same time, and especially by the Prime Minister Andrus Ansip, that the ultimate symbolism of the monument for Estonia is a profoundly negative one. It ultimately represents something that Estonians wanted to forget. Ansip commented about the significance of removing the monument, but also of the significance of sort of quelling these demonstrations. The demonstrations were very widespread for that in Tallinn for that one night, but only one person ultimately died, and it's imagine that he was, in fact, the kind of Russian martyr to the cause, was actually trampled by other protesters rather than done in any way by the police. One irony of the demonstrations was that the shops that were broken into and destroyed and all the looting that took place on that evening was largely directed against members of the Russian community in Tallinn, or at least those shops that happened to be locally accessible, were in the possession of other Russians. So it did not, in fact, amount to exactly this clash between Estonia and Russia on the ground that it was sort of played up to be, or imagined to be in the media. But it also culminated in a longer way because of an attack, a cyber attack that took place in the aftermath on Estonian banks and on the Soviet cyber technology in the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which was founded here a year later. And it entered, I think, into broader European memory and international memory in precisely these terms. You can read about all of this in articles from The Guardian, like Fake News and Botnets, How Russia Weaponized the Web, where the Bronze Soldier riots and the incident here played a kind of crucial or important role. Now, some of the people, two of the Estonians who were most vehement in their protests against keeping the monument in the center of town and also in dealing harshly with the demonstrators were Ageta Pavel and Aili Jürgenson or Jõgi, two women who were teenagers back in the early 1940s when the monument was first built. They in fact had been sent off to Soviet labor camps for their role in blowing up an earlier vision of the monument when Russia came, or the Soviet Union with Russia leading it, came to power in 1945. In other words, this monument, or the spot, or the location of the monument, was already a highly politicized place with a highly politicized meaning. And that Estonians saw their national suffering as really being kind of symbolized by this monument itself. It was because of this monument, in some sense, that so many were deprived of their freedom for so long. Now, my aim here in today's talk is to kind of make sense of this politicization and to try to extract out of this politicization what we might learn about Estonia's place in the world and in Europe, and its internal, you can say, tensions and conflicts. And I want to turn here in the third part of this presentation to the three faces of Prime Minister Andrus Ansip. The man who was responsible for removing the monument, Andrus Ansip, was also, in an interesting way, implicated by the past in ways that perhaps are not noticed or commented upon by historical observers. The Soviet Estonian poet Rudolf Rimmel wrote a poem in the 1960s, which has been subsequently used by the historian Mark Masauer to talk about the problem of decolonization, decolonizing Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet period, because it poses so well the question of self-transformation. Rimmel wrote, "Small fish will turn into dolphins, so will the sharks because it has to be so." Rimmel here was talking about the question that Masauer extracts from this poem is whether former Soviet elites can be turned into national elites. Can small fish be turned into dolphins? Can even sharks be turned into dolphins? Can people who were associated with the repressions of the past become leaders of a new national elite today? It's an open question. But this is very well dramatized by the three faces of Prime Minister Ansip. Ansip was, on the face of it, and to many in the West, in the Western media, his first face, you could say, was that of an ardent neoliberal. As apostle of Milton Friedman and Steve Forbes, the most ardent supporter of Estonia's neoliberal economic policies, trying to ingratiate Estonia within a global network of power and the American sphere of influence, trying to find a way for America to bring the market. In the Russian press, Andrus Ansip is represented primarily as a nationalist and even as a fascist. There are images of him as a fascist in Russian periodicals from this time, and you can see him kind of representing extreme Estonian nationalism to the Russian minority in Estonia. But there's a third face that is perhaps very little known outside of the Estonian community itself, and that is that Andrus Ansip was attempting, in some sense, in the course of these events, to play down his communist past. He had been an important, well, actually, maybe not so important, but a minor communist official in Tartu in 1988 when the singing revolution began that started the process of Estonian independence, and had been accused of and apparently was responsible for repressing the demonstration of nationally minded Estonian students back in 1988 at Tartu University. So according to one, at least, local Estonian interpretation, Andrus Ansip's third face, as a kind of hidden Estonian communist, is what explains everything here. It's because he was trying to play down his communist past, trying to show his nationalist credentials to Estonians, and prove that he can operate as a neoliberal in the larger global economy, that he ultimately was so adamant in his position that the statue of the bronze soldier needed to be removed from the center of town to the cemetery on the periphery. In his comments, too, about how Estonia has to be both a nationalist and a liberal, neoliberal, you could say, a state. Among other things that he said at the time was that the goal, in commenting upon the situation, was that the goal of the government was to stop the gradual slipping of Estonia under the control of Russia. We have simply believed that by being a member of the European Union and NATO, the past no longer poses a threat to us, he wrote. We did not notice, or we did not wish to notice, the dramatically transformed policy developed by Russia could also change. We did not wish to notice how the dramatically transformed policy developed by Russia could also change the attitudes of people living in Estonia. When Estonia restored its independence, Russia also admitted the existence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Right now it is being denied. There's no analysis or regret concerning the past. History has been locked up again. I think the statement shows very clearly the fears that Ansip was responding to. But unless you know his own communist demons in the past, it's impossible, perhaps psychologically, to explain precisely why he took the position he took with the kind of vehemence that he did. I want to conclude my remarks to you today by reflecting a little more broadly on the place of the Estonian imagined community in the global village. The imagined community, as many of you probably know, is the way in which Benedict Anderson, in a famous book from 1981, defined a nation, a state. The global village, some of you might know as well, though I imagine fewer of you, was a term coined or popularized in the 1960s by the Canadian intellectual Marshall McLuhan in his work Gutenberg Galaxy, as predicting the coming of the internet, predicting the coming of a day when we'll be so integrated electronically with people all around the world that the whole world will turn into a village. And in the final part of this talk to you, I want to reflect on the significance or the value of the imagined community in the global village by looking at Estonia's place in the wider world. Now, the incident of the bronze soldier that I have dramatized for you a little bit today and tried to unpack, I think is a helpful example and access point for thinking about Estonia's place in the wider world. But first, we need to remind ourselves that Estonia's meaning to the wider world, even to Russia and even to the Soviet Union, was an eminently European one throughout most of the Soviet period. Over the course of Soviet history, in many different places, in many different ways, Estonia was the Soviet West and the Soviet Europe. One prominent place this comes out is in the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his Gulag Archipelago, the great work that exposed the existence of the Soviet labor camp and system to the Western world in 1973. It was already circulating in Samizdat long before. But in the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn mentions a man he came to know in prison, in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow. The man was Arnold Susi, and in the last sentence of this passage he talks about how this man, with his eminently European education, with his multiple languages, now in our cell modestly and honorably represented Europe. This idea that Estonia is Europe and symbolized Europe was important in the Soviet Union. It was important throughout the 1990s, and nowhere was that more clearly brought out than in the remarks and in the presidency of Lennart Meri. If any of you ultimately manage to come to Estonia at some point for real, you'll be landing in Lennart Meri Airport, which has been named for this president. President from 1992 to 2001, eminently European figure, spoke multiple languages, often compared to Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia or in the Czech Republic. Was also named the European of the Year in 1998, when a European politics and a vision of European integration was mostly met with positively and with hope and with a sense of its eminent feasibility as well. But I think nowhere better than a speech that he gave at the University of London back in 2000 reminds us of the way in which, even in the year 2000, the relationship of Estonia to Europe was seen as one of mutual need and mutual support. How Estonia resembles Europe and Europe resembles Estonia. Here he claimed that Britain, he remarked to his British audience, I imagine in English, I mean he was perfectly competent to speak English at a high level, that Britain is an island, Estonia is an island too, Estonian is an island in an ocean of Indo-European languages. When saying the word island, I mean almost exactly the same that you in Britain mean by the term splendid isolation. In the past millennium, all our communication with Europe took place by sea. This is the answer to the Estonians' most essential question, namely, why have we not drowned in the Indo-European Ocean? How have we managed to maintain our identity? And he answers the question as well. An island, as you know, unites two opposites. Being an island, it is at the same time more open to the outside world than a landlocked country is. It is open to all external influences, but only to the extent that the navigation season, customs, curiosity, and the market allow it to be. In my opinion, the answer to the question of how a culture so small in numbers can survive lies in the constant conflict of inclusive and exclusive qualities. In many ways, back in 2000, Lennart Meri anticipates the question I posed to you at the beginning of this lecture and gives us an answer too, of how, as an island, Estonia can survive as an integral part of Europe, how it can be opened and closed at the same time. The tone of his talk, the optimism of this talk, speaks to an optimism that was widespread up until, I think, 2003 or 4, that the small countries, the post-Soviet countries of Eastern Europe, could be somehow easily and effectively and without greater conflicts incorporated into the larger European community and into the larger global community, the larger global village, if you will. It's precisely a confidence that this is easy or feasible, possible, that dies in the first years of the 21st century. And in my last couple slides, I would just like to alert you to a few sources and a few works that might help us, or might help you, and we can talk about this later, to think about the way in which Estonia and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, here I'm going to call attention to Latvia for a moment, are all caught in this difficult position of a disillusionment with the promises of the 1990s, the promises of an easy integration into Europe, where openness and or inclusiveness and exclusivity can be made to work in a way that brings benefits for everyone, and that everyone in the longer run can be happy with. In her book, School of Europeanness, Dacia Cynovska, a friend of mine from UC Berkeley, she was doing a doctorate in anthropology when I was doing my doctorate in history there, writes about this exact same problem as it afflicts Latvians and as it afflicts, and how incorporation into Europe has become a major question mark and a major problem. School of Europeanness, Tolerance and Other Lessons in Political Liberalism in Latvia is really a book that focuses on the 1990s and concludes in the 2000s, but notes how many Europeans, many people from abroad, many Americans, many foreign-born Latvians came to Latvia with a hope that they could make Latvia European. And they did this largely through tolerance, which he calls tolerance initiatives, trying to teach Latvians the virtues of tolerance. But as she points out, Latvians do not identify with a normative vision of Europe as a source of universal values of freedom, democracy, and human rights, but tend to identify rather with European colonialism. The post-colonial and post-socialist predicament of Latvia and the tolerance promotion that was taken up by many sort of Western tolerance workers, as she describes them, led to an advocacy for critical thinking skills, teaching the right vision, ultimately, of European history, creating new liberal subjects free of Eastern European chauvinism and prejudice, who will finally be good enough and for true democracy. Now, the fact that she's writing about the 1990s grasps and reminds us of the optimism of those 1990s, that this is all possible, that we can overcome these tendencies towards inclusion and exclusion, that we can make our national communities reconcilable with a larger European and global project. That tolerance and critical thinking skills are all it takes to make the world a better place and to give Eastern Europe, and Latvia in this case, a place in it. But as Dacia argues ultimately in her book, this initiative stumbled against the recognition ultimately that Latvia and post-Soviet Eastern Europe more generally has a very different conception of history and of its place in the world. The way it remembers the past, the way it remembers its own identity, is not something that can be just talked away through encouraging people to be more tolerant or teaching critical thinking skills to overcome our benighted past. Latvia, like Estonia, eagerly embraced a neoliberal vision of the world. A neoliberal, that is to say, a market economic conception of its place in the world. But it did not embrace political liberalism with nearly the same kind of enthusiasm. And Dotz's book gives us one way, at least, to make sense of why that was and why that happens, which was also the question with which I began this talk to you today. If you're interested in a Russian perspective on how all of this works and a foreign policy perspective, I invite you to look up Alexander Ostrov, and perhaps particularly his essay Estonia, The Political Battle for a Place in History. Ostrov, maybe more than any other commentator, calls attention to the paradox of EU and NATO accession in the 2003 and 2004 period, and points out that while incorporation into the security network of NATO and to the kind of economic network of the European Union should have appeased fears for Eastern Europeans and for small states like Estonia, in fact, it did just the opposite. It precipitated a kind of ontological anxiety, an anxiety about Estonia's, Latvia's, Lithuania's, all of Eastern Europe's sort of place in the wider world. And one reason for that, and this is something that I haven't really emphasized so far, but I think is worth thinking about, we can talk about as well, is that Europe itself does not have a clear picture of its own identity. Europe doesn't know what kind of attitude it wants to take toward Soviet history. The problems of the bronze soldier, of this debate about the past in Estonia, are in fact, in some larger sense, European problems. Key to this debate is the very concept of totalitarianism itself. Is totalitarianism a helpful concept through which to understand the Soviet past? Totalitarianism as a concept that was developed really, was born in fascist Italy, but it was developed really in Cold War United States by Eastern European refugees like Hannah Arendt, like Brzezinski, like Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, to try to show how the Nazi regimes and the Soviet regimes were morally and functionally similar, how they operated in the same way. Today, it's hard to know what to do with the Soviet past. And for those Europeans who are willing to use this model, it's very clear that an image like the bronze soldier should be ultimately condemned. But for those who want to preserve a vision of the Soviet Union and the bronze soldier as a symbol of the Soviet Union, as a liberating force, this is not possible. Ultimately, we end up with a politics of history that is as much European as it is national and local. I include one quotation from the article here. Politics as a whole, writes Ostrov, comes down to the question formulated by the respective Estonian political commentator, N. Soosaar. Is it even possible, in general, to cultivate loyal citizens of the Republic of Estonia from the lens of thousands who believe Russian propaganda more than historical facts and documents? And if so, how? Ostrov is reminding us that the question of the bronze soldier is ultimately an ontological question in Estonia, a question of being, a question of who we are in the wider world, how we can remember, or how we ought to remember the past. The famous French scholar Ernst Renan, in 1882, in a lecture at the Sorbonne, published his essay, gave his talk of what is a nation, where he observed that nations are built simultaneously out of remembering and out of forgetting. One could argue, in our century, in our time, that the entire world and the global community, the global village is itself built out of acts of memory and forgetting. And the bronze soldier, perhaps more than any other monument in Estonia, perhaps in the wider world to some extent too, reminds us of how much our memory and our forgetting plays a role in how we create the political communities in which we participate, their relative inclusiveness, their exclusiveness, and how hard it is to reconcile ourselves to the past in a world where the past is still violent and remembered for its violence and for the violence it has inflicted upon our own people. My last slide now to you, and the last idea I want to arrive at, well, begins here at least with Estonia's Conservative People's Party. And I want to just make a gesture. I haven't spoken at all really about the Conservative People's Party of Estonia, but in many ways the EKRE, as it is known in Estonian Conservative People's Party of Estonia, is Estonia's participation in the age of Trump, in the age of populism, a party that seeks to reclaim the nation for Estonian nationalism against other forms of Estonian nationalism and other forms of political belonging. Why it happened and how it happened at all is one of the great, you could say, problems that is at stake in the writings, or in my presentation today, in the writings of Datsun, so far as her teachings about Latvia apply to Estonia as well, the problem of bringing political as well as economic liberalism to the Baltic. And they resonate with Ostrov's comments upon foreign policy and international community as well, that Estonia's troubles with the past have as much to do with its place in Europe and with Europe's inability to define its own relationship to the past. All of these are ways of making sense of why populism happens and how it happens in Europe and in the world at large. And in this last slide here, I want to give you one final way of thinking about this, which comes in fact from a different quarter, from political economy or from the economic discipline. It's the work of the Harvard political economist Danny Roderick in his work, The Globalization Paradox, where he points out how our difficulties creating a world of effectively integrated national communities has really become apparent in the 2000s in a way that it wasn't in the 1990s, precisely because we have come to see how globalization gets in the way of national democracy. Globalization is all about minimizing transaction costs, but it's not about keeping up labor standards or health and safety standards. These are the things that national governments and sometimes even populist national movements claim to support and to speak out on behalf of. But Roderick offers us, and this is what I want to leave you with, a trilemma, which he says will help us to understand why we are where we are today. A trilemma that really consists of three forces dominating the world: hyperglobalization, the promise of national sovereignty, and also, and interesting, he separates out here, the promise of democracy. We're caught between people, agents who speak out on behalf of each one. An international global business elite speaks out on behalf of hyperglobalization. The national elites of various countries speak out on behalf of national sovereignty. And the masses continue to appeal to an ideal of democracy. But reconciling all three has become impossible, especially in a world that sees that national elites and international elites are no longer speaking the same language. Well, neither literally nor figuratively. For many years, up until the end of the 1990s perhaps, one could say the world was dominated by the Bretton Woods compromise, a compromise between national elites and the masses. A compromise worked out in New Hampshire and Bretton Woods to establish the new foundations for a global economy, a protectionist, Keynesian, social democratic, you say, world economy. But as that has given away, and ultimately given away in the 1990s, to the vision of the golden straitjacket and hyperglobalization, we've seen an alliance instead, not between national elites and the masses or their own people, but national elites and international elites, between businessmen and between those who claim to speak out for the national community. To conclude this talk I want to simply point out that if the last portion of this lecture was simply to give you a few different ways of imagining, thinking about how the Bronze Soldier riots that took place on April 26th in the capital of Estonia, in Tallinn, might speak to larger questions and problems about our globalizing world order and the European community, which is its part. And here at the end, I invited you to think about 3 ways in which remembering the importance of the national community and national identity and the weight, the tenacity of the national past, how this phenomenon, which has especially great importance in Estonia and Eastern Europe, plays a role or can help us find a vision for understanding what's gone wrong with the world today. Why national elites, international elites, and the masses are all, in some sense, speaking different languages. Why, as Ostroff pointed out, the inability of the European community to find a common set of values for speaking about the Soviet past exists in the first place. And why economic liberalism and political liberalism are at such loggerheads, in such contradiction with each other in a place like post-Soviet Latvia and Estonia. But I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation.